Okay, everyone, today we're going to talk about Erik Erikson and his psychosocial theory. If you've taken a course in psychology across the lifespan, I am sure that you've heard about his theory, so we'll review it here today. Okay, first, in his theory, we have to understand that there are, unlike Freud, there are stages that go from birth to old age. Really, with Freud, he focused more on what was happening during childhood and maybe early adolescence. Okay, and at each stage there is a crisis, a psychosocial turning point. Now, when we say crisis, we're not necessarily talking about some catastrophe. We're just talking about a kind of a central issue that needs to be dealt with. Okay? And at this point, you're in a period of vulnerability, but it's also a period where growth can occur if you can successfully resolve this crisis. Okay? So here, the central theme is the development of your ego identity, a conscious sense of self. This is a difference between Erikson and Freud, with Freud being more the unconscious that seems to be more relevant. But here it's your ego, your conscious identity that's key. And it develops from your interactions with your social environment, your interactions with other people. Okay, this again is another difference from Freud. It's more about how you interact with others rather than what is going on inside your personality. Okay, basically, you develop a sense of competency when you can, essentially successfully resolve a particular stage. So let's talk about some of the early psychosocial stages. First one is in infancy, the first year of life. And the main issue here, the main crisis, is trust versus mistrust. Okay? And why is this a central issue according to Erikson? Well, the infant is entirely dependent upon others for its basic needs. It's dependent on its mother for, for caring for it, for feeding it and whatnot. So it needs to develop a trusting relationship with its caregiver. Okay? If you can trust that your caregiver will be there for you when you need to have your needs met, then you can basically trust that the world is predictable and that you can actually get your needs met in the real world. And again, this carries with you throughout your entire life. If you have a sense of trust that things will work out, basically that you can have an understanding of the world around you in that respect. Okay? The ego strength of hope, the belief that wishes are attainable, is the ego strength that develops from successfully resolving the trust versus mistrust. Okay, and again, so this is essentially what you want to be able to achieve when you get through this. Now realize this, and this is true for all of the stages that we discussed today. Trust is generally good and mistrust is generally bad, but you cannot have all of one or all of the other. You need to have a sense of balance. It's definitely better to be trusting than to mistrust, but to be completely trusting is being gullible and being able to be taken advantage of. So you need to have a sense of skepticism. You need to have a sense of mistrust, a realization that not all the time are your needs going to be taken care of. So having that sense of mistrust is important as well. But to successfully resolve it, have that sense of hope. Okay, the next stage, early childhood, second and third year. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Now, think about those years of age 2 and 3. Corresponds to Freud's anal stage. So think about what is happening for the child ages 2 and 3. The anal stage, obviously the main issue with Freud is toilet training. But in Erikson's case, it goes beyond just potty training. It goes through various other activities. The child is essentially being able to act on the environment. Okay, so being able to control what you do, like not just controlling your bowels, but I mean controlling your activities. That's a sense of competency there. The ego strength of will, the determination to exercise free choice, is the main factor here. It's the main ego strength that's developed from here. So again, you're essentially at the age 2 and 3. You're learning to crawl. You're learning to walk. You're learning to do those basic things that give you a sense of I can do this. I can do this. Okay? Which then kind of gets more advanced a little bit to the next stage, ages 3 to 5, initiative versus guilt. Now you're really taking action onto the environment here. This is where you're getting a sense of power in the world, acting on others, acting on the environment. Okay? The ego strength of purpose, the courage to pursue valued goals without fear of punishment. So if you're age 3 to 5 and mommy and daddy keep smacking your hand whenever you're trying to explore something, well, you are going to get a sense now of feeling guilt, a sense of feeling that, I guess I just can't, I'm not supposed to do this, I'm not supposed to do that. And essentially you become hesitant. You don't want to even take any first steps. So clearly, we want to be able to encourage our preschoolers to take the initiative. Maybe we don't want them, drawing crayons all over our walls, but we want them to be able to take some action on their own and be confident to do so. As we're approaching adolescence now, school age, between age 5 and 11, the stage is industry versus inferiority. Now we're getting into more advanced levels of activity, ones that would occur, for example, in a school environment. And this is the basis for a sense of value and citizenship. So at the industry versus inferiority, you're now working on valued projects, and you want to produce maybe pieces of art or doing schoolwork that you want to be able to be proud of and have other people be proud of. So there's your sense of industry. So if, for example, during ages 5 through 11, if mommy and daddy essentially keep putting down your work, saying it's not good enough, it's not good enough, it's not good enough, maybe then you get a sense of inferiority, that you're just not good enough, your work is not good enough, I'm a failure. And we certainly don't want that to happen. And again, develop the ego strength of competence, the sense that you can do things that are valued by others. Now again, just like with all the other stages, you also don't want to have necessarily too much industry. You need to be able to accept criticism, for example. You need to be able to judge, some work is better than others. So you need to kind of have that sense of perhaps a humility maybe. But nevertheless, this is, this is important. Okay, here is a big one. Here is a stage that really Erikson takes a lot of interest in particular. The sense of identity versus role confusions between years age 12 through 20. Okay. Essentially what you're doing is you're trying to find out who you are, both privately and in your relationships with others. You say, who am I? In other words, internally, you might be asking yourself periodically, who am I? What am I really? What is my role? And, these are issues that you have to explore during this age period. Essentially, maybe trying different things, trying different roles, joining different groups, trying different college majors, for example. All of these are trying to establish your identity. If you find you keep going from one thing to another and you're not really comfortable with who you are, that's where you'd have that role confusion. Okay? So the ego strength of fidelity, being true to yourself, living up to who you really are. You know, you may try exploring different things, but eventually you kind of have to follow your path and be honest with who you are. Now, interestingly enough, Erikson himself went through this kind of period in his life, kind of exploring different roles, and he was a starving artist for a while. So, I mean, Erikson was someone who, you know, he just was, he didn't necessarily find himself until he went through this process. And again, realize that, you know, there are many times, you know, at any age you can kind of be going back to that. And that's the epigenetic principle, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. And according to Erikson, it's important to have an identity crisis. Okay? You've probably even heard that term, the identity crisis. That comes from Erikson. So that you have this crisis and allowing you to form a commitment to an identity. So in other words, you have to have that exploration. You have to be thinking about, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And unless you have that, you're not going to successfully resolve the stage, at least according to Erikson. Now, interestingly enough, James Marcia has explored the identity crisis even further, and he talks about that, for one thing, that not everybody goes through an identity crisis. And some people make a commitment before they even go through a crisis. So he developed the concept of identity statuses. And let's talk about that. He basically 4 statuses that involve the crisis and commitment. Okay, starting with crisis. Okay, so when you have a crisis, you're exploring different life choices. Again, this is consistent with what Erikson is talking about. The commitment, you're making the personal investment in a life choice. Again, with Erikson, the idea is, typically, the person goes through a crisis where they explore different choices, different aspects of whatever life they want to choose, and then they make their commitment. They choose the one that fits who they truly are, and they go with it. You know, they have their stages during adolescence, and then they move on and become the person that they really are. Okay? Well, according to Marcia, there can be any combination of these two. You can have a crisis without a commitment. You could have a commitment without a crisis. You could have neither a crisis nor a commitment, or you could have both. So let's talk about those. Start with identity diffusion. Identity diffusion, you're having no crisis and no commitment. Essentially, you are not even exploring different things. You're more or less just in a state of you know, you kind of in a state of like pause, not going forward, not going backward. You're just kind of hanging there, maybe just a couch potato, waiting for something to happen to you. Identity foreclosure. This is where you have a commitment, but you have no crisis. So with foreclosure, the idea is, you've decided to make a commitment, a choice in your life. You've made it a life choice, but you really haven't given much thought to it. Maybe it's something like, you know, you join the family business because that's what you're expected to do. You don't even think about trying anything else. So the identity foreclosure is you make that commitment, but you don't even try to make the exploration of different choices. Identity moratorium. This is where you're in that state of crisis, but you haven't had a commitment. Oftentimes that moratorium is a temporary state where you're currently going through a crisis, but you haven't yet made a commitment. But then again, a person could go through an identity moratorium for the rest of their life. They could be always trying to reinvent themselves, always trying to think about who they are for the rest of someone's life. A constant state of moratorium. Finally, identity achievement. This would be presumably the ideal, is that you go through the crisis, which leads to your commitment to your identity. And again, this is consistent of the successful resolution of the identity stage of Erikson's theory. So again, here's a kind of summary of what it looks like here. With the crisis, the identity diffusion, you have neither crisis, the crisis is absent, the commitment is absent, identity achievement, you have both the crisis and the commitment. So, gives you an idea. Now, what's interesting about Erikson's theory is that it goes all the way through life, different stages that we go through. And I think this is definitely an appealing aspect of his theory as opposed to Freud. Furthermore, another appealing aspect to it is it's not focused on psychosexual, it's psychosocial. So your interactions with others, your social interactions, it ain't all just about sex. Although some people might disagree. Young adulthood, during your 20s, intimacy versus isolation. Well, what's happening during this period most of the time? This is where you're starting to develop relationships, romantic relationships, but not just romantic, but also deep, close friendships as well. And this is the intimacy versus isolation. And the ego strength of love develops at this particular stage. And think about what's happening here. You're forming a relationship. But think about a romantic relationship you're having in your 20s. I think that most of you are in your 20s. You have a romantic relationship and you want to bond with this person. You want to develop a sense of intimacy, that sense of closeness. You want to share yourself with that person. Share your life with that person, right? Well, do you want to have a complete and utter intimacy? Or do you want to, is that completely healthy? Or do you want to have some sense of isolation as well? I think you have to remember that moving from the identity crisis to young adulthood, during the previous stage, you're really focusing on developing your own personal identity. Now, at this stage, you're sharing it with somebody else. That involves a certain amount of risk to share aspects of yourself with somebody else. Some people refuse to do that, and they remain isolated. They don't want to get close to anybody. Kind of sounds like that either dismissing or fearful avoidance. The attachment style of avoidance, where you just don't want to get close to anybody. With the intimacy, maybe if you're overboard on the intimacy, maybe you're just, losing yourself in a relationship, and that maybe sounds kind of like preoccupied, where you're not developing a sense of your own self, merging with somebody else. So bottom line is, sure, intimacy is better than isolation, but nevertheless, you still want to maintain a certain level of independence and separateness from your partner. Hey, live your own life. Share yourself with your partner, but be comfortable living your own lives. As we get into mid-adulthood, middle age, generativity versus stagnation. This is where you are making contributions to the future. Now, think about it here as you're having children, so that you are teaching your children, you're watching them grow, you're helping them grow, okay? But you can go through this stage without necessarily having children. You could also, in your work relationships, in your friendship relationships, just helping other people, giving advice, helping them succeed, making a contribution to the world around you. All of that involves generativity. Stagnation is kind of like stuck in like a dead-end job, maybe, where you're not really feeling like you're making any contribution to the future. That's kind of a depressing sounding thing. Then again, you still want to have some sort of balance. You don't want to have some pauses here. You don't want to necessarily be constantly devoting yourself to every cause around you. You also want to kind of pause at some time. So you don't want to necessarily have complete generativity. I think that's just physically impossible. But nevertheless, this is very important. This is where you're making a contribution for the future, making your mark. The ego strength of care. You want to care for others, care for the future. And this would be a healthy way of getting through this particular stage. Finally, in old age, ego integrity versus despair. Well, what's happening at old age? You're getting close to dying, right? You kind of want at this point maybe look back at your life and see, did my life have meaning? Have have I made a contribution? What have I done? And, kind of putting it all together. And that's a sense of ego integrity. Looking at your ego and kind of, seeing it as a complete structure, your life is a sense of completeness. On the other hand, if you felt that your life had no meaning, you get unfortunately, a sense of despair. So, at the end of this at this stage, you develop the ego strength of wisdom, learning from your experiences, being able to share that with others, but also being able to kind of, look back at your life and have a sense that my life had meaning. The epigenetic principle is an important aspect of Erikson's theory. We went through the different stages from birth to old age: trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and the ego integrity versus despair. Okay, so we've gone through all these different stages. The epigenetic principle essentially states that at any point in a person's life, all of these stages, all of these issues can exist simultaneously. For example, trust versus mistrust. Clearly, during infancy, this is the focal point of your life. Are my needs going to be met? Can I trust this person to take care of me, take care of my needs? Is the world a predictable place? Well, these are issues that carry with you throughout your entire life, in your social relationships, in your romantic relationships, at work, all throughout. So trust versus mistrust is something that is throughout your life. And again, the same can be said for all of these different stages. Okay. Furthermore, how you resolve an earlier outcome influences how you resolve later outcomes. You will often use your solutions from a previous crisis to prepare yourself for a later crisis. So you're always looking forward and being able to use what you've already learned for future crises. And you could also revisit previous crises at various parts of your life. You could, for example, have an identity crisis at age 40. You might decide, I want to go back to school and become a nurse, for example. That might be something where you're going through an identity crisis, and you're looking, reinventing yourself, even at long past adolescence. So again, we recognize that trust permeates through all the different theories, the psychosocial theories that you might have seen. Object relations, if you look before this PowerPoint, sense of trust is important. Develop new relations with the objects being other people. So clearly, trust is an issue in attachment, as we've said before. All right, at this point, I want to move on, and we'll talk about the humanistic perspective in our next lecture.